Welcome to Within the Frame, where we bring the most pressing issues across the globe into focus. I'm Kim Mok-yeon. The South Korea-Japan summit in Andong highlighted just how closely regional security and economic concerns are now intertwined. President Lee Jae-myung and Japanese Prime Minister Takaichi Sanae reaffirmed close Korea-U.S. Japan coordination on North Korea, while also discussing broader Indo-Pacific security, tensions in the Middle East, critical mineral supply chains, and possible energy cooperation, including LNG and oil swaps. Now, at the same time, signs of renewed activity at North Korea's Tongchang-ri launch site are raising fresh concerns over another possible satellite launch, as debate also grows over the Lee administration's evolving approach towards inter-Korean relations. So tonight, we examine the shifting security landscape surrounding the Korean Peninsula and what these developments could mean going forward. And for this, we're joined in the studio by Dr. Kim Mok-yeon, Senior Research Fellow at the Institute for National Security Strategy. A very big welcome, Dr. Go.
Thanks for having me.
And also joining us online is Brian Myers, professor at Dongsan University's Minsa College of Liberal Arts. Good to see you.
It's great to be with you.
So let's start with Dr. Go. So following the summit between Korea and Japan in Andong yesterday, President Lee said he hopes to build a peninsula where there's no need to actually fight. Do you think there was any progress in terms of the North Korea coordination during the summit?
No, I think the Japan and Korea, they see eye to eye when it comes to the necessity of having close coordination on the security, not just in the Korean Peninsula, but in the wider region. And I think Korea and Japan have different objectives and expectations about North Korea. But then I think for now, Seoul and Tokyo have agreed that it's probably not best to highlight these differences. So rather, it's better to focus on the commonalities or the overlapping interest. And I think the overlapping interest right now is to respect each other's aims when it comes to North Korea. Clearly, South Korea puts priority on engaging North Korea. I think that's what President Lee was alluding to when he mentioned that he aspires to have a Korean Peninsula where there's no need for fight. I think it's essentially paraphrasing of his policy of engagement, putting engagement before denuclearization. But we know that Japan's policy towards in the region, it's much more proactive, that puts priority on deterrence. We know that Japan is essentially expanding its defense expenditure. And not just that, is in fact essentially assuming a very proactive military posture, not just on North Korea, but also on China. So I think what the Japanese and the South Korean leaders have essentially said in Andong is that they are essentially going to have a common front. And having a common front is very important right now because the growing emergence of the China, Russia, North Korea axis in this part of the world. So even though Korea and Japan might not see eye to eye on all issues, having a common front when we are facing together an alignment of authoritarian regimes is going to be very important going forward.
Focusing on mutual interests, it kind of reflects a push to lower tensions as well. Now, President Lee also stressed the importance of trilateral cooperation among Korea, China, and Japan for what he called genuine peace and stability in the region. But of course, with tensions between China and Japan still ongoing, Professor Myers, how should Seoul approach this trilateral cooperation moving forward?
Well, very carefully. You know, there are lots of reasons why the three countries should cooperate. They're economically interconnected, so they have a shared interest in preserving supply chains, and they're all dealing with a pretty unpredictable Trump administration. So the more stability that they can maintain among themselves, the better. Of course, we need to be realistic. You're not going to see, say, security cooperation between all three countries, and the days when Beijing would put serious pressure on Pyongyang are over, I think. But solving regional problems of mutual concern is not too much to hope for. And I think South Korea can play a very helpful middle power role here. But everything should be kept on a practical and functional level. And I think that means, you know, relying on working level diplomats as opposed to flashy summits where one leader or another may want to grandstand to a domestic audience in some way. I think if they want to work together, they need to stay away from historical issues. They need to stay away from the issue of Taiwan, and they need to block out disruptive noise from Washington. Now, that won't be easy, but President Lee has turned out to be a much more pragmatic and centrist leader than most of us expected. He did a good job of stressing commonalities with the Japanese leader, as Dr. Go just said. And I think he can do a good job of setting the right tone for trilateral cooperation.
That's where the Lee administration's a pragmatic approach actually when it kicks in. But as for North Korea, Dr. Go, Japan's latest defense paper described North Korea as a more serious and imminent threat compared to before. So how could this tougher stance coming from Japan affect, security on the peninsula?
Again, I think Korea completely understands where Japanese a characterization of what North Korean threat comes from. And in fact, what the Japanese defense white paper is echoing is the national defense strategy that was published earlier this year by the United States Department of War, where characterizes North Korea as an existential threat to the United States. So it's completely along the same line as the United States government when it comes to characterizing North Korea's growing missile and nuclear capabilities. And in fact, that's the reflection of the reality on the ground. So I think then at the same time, Japan needs to formulate this kind of a strong policy position towards North Korea, because right now Japan is engaged in essentially an arms buildup. Japan is, for the first time, is acquiring and deploying long-range strike capabilities, and they serve two purposes. One is clearly to defend the country in case of contingency over Taiwan. So in this case, the potential adversary for the Japanese long-range strike capability will be China. But also, Japan is fully aware that some of North Korea's long-range missile capabilities are targeting them. So I think essentially the Japanese have a deterrence first view of North Korea. So I think there's a gap clearly between Seoul and Tokyo's position regarding North Korea. But again, I think it's not going to cause a major problem in our bilateral relations with Japan.
Considering the current circumstances, of course. Now, going back to the recent U.S.-China summit, Washington said in a fact sheet that both sides reaffirmed the goal of North Korea's denuclearization, but China avoided mentioning denuclearization altogether, only saying its policy towards the Korean Peninsula remains consistent. Professor Myers, what do you make of that gap in messaging?
Well, I don't think even the Americans are all that urgent about North Korea's denuclearization anymore. So I'd have to differ with Dr. Go a little bit on that regard. President Trump has already referred to it as a nuclear power, and the national security strategy that was published in Washington last winter did not mention denuclearizing the North. And the American mainstream talk about Kim Jong-un in much kinder terms than they talk about, say, Vladimir Putin. I think what President Trump really wants is for Kim Jong-un to come to the negotiating table so that a small deal can be made. And he wants China, he wants Xi Jinping to push Kim to the table. But I think the Chinese have no interest in seeing Washington and Pyongyang improve their relationship. China, Russia, and North Korea, this so-called authoritarian bloc, really has to hang together in these difficult times. I'm sure that's how Beijing sees things. And Xi Jinping certainly does not want to give Donald Trump any kind of diplomatic victory with which he can, shore up his declining international stature. So I think that difference in the statements reflects a pretty serious difference in attitude, and that's not going to go away.
What about Dr. Go? Do you agree that this latest U.S.-China summit has led to some expanded role for China? And do you think it would happen, this expanded role for China? And what could that mean for South Korea?
Well, China is having an expanded role in other global affairs as well. And much because the United States is too focused on what's going on in the Middle East, and it needs Chinese cooperation to ensure not just stability in the region, in Northeast Asia, but also in the Middle East and the energy markets and the global finance and so forth and so forth. So one of the unintended byproduct of the recent summit between President Trump and President Xi has been essentially, in a way, legitimizing the G2 or Great Power 2 kind of a framework that the United States government had tried to avoid But then now the perception is so strong that China will have an expanded role in any kind of diplomatic developments in this part of the world. But having said that, though, I think echoing back what Professor Meyer said in the earlier answers, I think it's very interesting that China and the United States mentioned North Korea in their joint fact sheet. Sure, like the United States and China don't see eye to eye when it comes to the policy priority on North Korea. Clearly, Washington thinks that denuclearization has to be placed before anything else. China is essentially remaining ambiguous about it. But nonetheless, if you look at the joint fact sheet, the two sides, Washington and Beijing, have so many outstanding issues. But then, surprisingly, there's one line that mentioned North Korea out of blue. And I think this is, very interesting that especially contradicts what, the expectation that so much has had about President Trump's potential approach towards North Korea through China, which is people expected President Trump to sound much more conciliatory. But then what came out is that the United States is essentially reaffirming its existing policy line towards North Korea, which is basically the same as before, denuclearization. But I think it's interesting that China has agreed to include this in their own readouts as well. And I think this is a signals that Beijing wants, first and foremost, the maintenance of the status quo in the peninsula. So clearly it's against United States putting more pressure on Pyongyang. But I think it's a subtle criticism of North Korea trying to raise tension, for instance, by working very closely with Russia, by also showcasing its long-range missile capabilities. I think in that sense, this statement can be read as a signal for what China is having in mind for its future approach towards North Korea.
Mm-hmm. So we'll have to look into China's next moves very closely from on. Now, when we turn to domestic developments, the Lee Jae-myung administration released its first unification white paper on the 18th, and there's already debate surrounding this phrase called a peaceful two-state relationship. And the unification ministry says this is part of a strategy aimed at institutionalizing peaceful coexistence between the two Koreas. Professor Myers, how would you read into that?
I don't think that this phrase represents a fundamental departure from the history of inter-Korean relations. If you look at the joint communique that was signed back in 1972, so over a half century ago, you had the Park Chung-hee regime implicitly treating the North as a legitimate system that deserved a measure of respect. And then, of course, in 2000, you had President Kim Dae-jung and Kim Jong-il talking about working together toward a confederation or a league. Now, obviously, a state cannot confederate with a non-state. So that summit declaration was at least an implicit violation of the South Korean constitution, as were the summits in 2007 and 2018. All that has changed with this white paper, I think, is the explicitness of South Korea's recognition of North Korea as a state. Now, I don't mean to downplay the importance of the South Korean constitution, and I do wonder if that phrase absolutely had to be used. So I do understand the controversy which this phrase has aroused on the right of the political spectrum here. But, let's remember that the white paper still upholds the commitment to unification. It doesn't emphasize it, sure, but it upholds it. And so long as that's the case, in my opinion, the relationship is still a special co-ethnic one, just as the relationship between the two Germanys was a special co-ethnic one right up until 1990. So I don't think this is a reason to abandon all hope for unification. And I think it is perhaps a constructive step forward in the relations between the two countries.
Mm-hmm. So we could be too early to look into too much of a meaning on that. Now, when we stay with the white paper, Dr. Go, this year's white paper emphasized peaceful coexistence and dialogue, of course, but references to unification and North Korean human rights, the portion has been reduced. So what do you think that means for future South Korean policies on North Korea?
Well, I think the South Korea's policy towards North Korea follows a cycle. So whenever there's a conservative administration, there's clearly the highlight on the human rights situation in North Korea. When it's followed by a progressive administration, it alternates. The priority goes to the engagement. So we are seeing exactly that cycle. We are living through that cycle right now. So I think it's like clockwork. I think North Koreans are not surprised by this. But the most important here is not so much about the restating of the order of our priorities for South Korea or North Korea, but rather how the government is intending to achieve these aims. And clearly, the Lee Jae-myung government is very keen on restoring interkorean relations with the North. But then I think the hurdle is pretty major. It's not on the South Korean side. It's definitely on the North Korean side with their official implementation of the two hostile states doctrine, which has been incorporated into the constitution. So these are major hurdles that not South Korea, but North Korea will have to somehow accommodate if they want to reapproach the South. So it'll be interesting to see how the North Koreans are going to respond to these gestures coming from Seoul to re-engage them. So I think this is going to be a fascinating couple of years.
Mm-hmm. Now, shifting gears a little bit, recently signs were detected that North Korea conducted a rocket engine test at the Tongchang-ri Seohae satellite launching station. Now, given that this comes after Pyongyang unveiled plans for what it called more advanced reconnaissance satellites under its new 5-year defense plan, Professor Myers, could this signal that preparations for another launch are now underway?
Yeah, well, I guess that's the logical inference to draw from this news, considering that Tongchang-ri on the West Coast has always been the North's main launch site for satellite launches and launch attempts, well, at least for over 10 years. And it's not really surprising either, because Kim Jong-un did call earlier this year at the 9th Party Congress for the development and deployment of better reconnaissance satellites. And when he calls for something like that, it's usually a good indication that the relevant preparations are on schedule already. And, it's pretty standard procedure for North Korea to conduct engine tests before attempting a full launch. I think we saw an engine test before the Malilgyong launch attempt in 2024. Of course, the North talks about a civilian space program, but the goal is really a military one, because Kim Jong-un wants to be able to better monitor American, South Korean, and Japanese forces, which, I guess is only natural. Our side cannot really tighten trilateral military cooperation without expecting the North Koreans to respond accordingly by upping their game, technologically speaking.
Mm-hmm. Now, Dr. Myers, many people actually viewed the North Korean women's football team's visit to South Korea on the 17th as a rare moment of exchange amid this frozen inter-Korean ties. But on the very same day, Kim Jong-un ordered stronger controls along frontline units near the southern border. How should we interpret these seemingly conflicting signals from Pyongyang?
Well, I don't think they're really conflicting. Inter-Korean sports diplomacy has been a big thing in the past, but it was very obvious by how those soccer players arrived in this country that they did not come here to thaw the relationship. You can see that footage right now. If anything, you could say that those soccer players came here in order to underscore the change in the inter-Korean relationship. So you've got no charm offensive, no cheerleading squads, no smiles at the airport. It's all business. And you could tell the South Koreans were a bit hurt by this. They were a bit taken aback. Having said that, there is an inconsistency here, because on the one hand, Kim Jong-un wants to tighten the southern border, and he wants to keep out heterodox cultural influences, especially South Korean ones. But on the other hand, he wants to show his people that North Korea commands more respect around the world, and he wants to show the international community that this is a normal state. And he knows that sports do a wonderful job of entertaining and unifying the North Korean people, which doesn't get much opportunity to cheer on the national teams at big events like this.
Mm-hmm. So it's not really something quite new, and we'll have to see how this latest events would affect South Korea and North Korea ties moving forward. Now, as for now, we'll have to conclude our discussion right here tonight. Thank you so much for your insights, Professor Myers.
Thank you.
And of course, Dr. Go, we really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
And that'll be all from us on Within the Frame. Be sure to tune in again next time as we continue to explore the stories that matter. Until then, stay informed and engaged.